It is 13 minutes to 7. So a new report has found that every fire and rescue service in England has seen allegations of racist, sexist or homophobic comments and behaviours. Inspectors are now urging bosses to carry out background checks on every firefighter, which could result in people whose histories cause serious concern being forced to leave. Well, we're joined now by His Majesty's Inspector of Fire and Rescue Services, Roy Wilsher. Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us this morning. I mean, it's shocking to hear about the behaviour that's been going on and also how widespread it is. How has this been allowed to happen? How has it come to this situation?
Well, we found examples of poor behaviour and the sort of behaviour we're reporting now since we started inspecting the fire and rescue services back in 2018. I think this report is a watershed moment, and particularly the things we found, you've already said yourself, we've had reported bullying, harassment, discrimination in every service. We had examples of homophobia, sexism and racism in at least a quarter of services. One of the things that's really important is trust. Firefighters can do a difficult job and they need to trust each other. And all too often that trust was undermined by derogatory behaviour and things called banter that certainly aren't. And people were afraid to call that out. They're afraid to report it in case of reprisals or being ostracised or if their career might be limited. And you've mentioned yourself, one of the things we found, there's no standard for background checks on people joining the fire service. Some services do that well, some services don't, but certainly no standard.
Do you think that the fire service has a problem with race?
Well, we found examples of racism. I wouldn't say the whole fire and rescue service. I'd like to point out it's not every fire and rescue service, it's certainly not every fire station, but this happens all too often, whether it's homophobia...
But the report, sorry, Mr. Wilsher, the report says that every fire and rescue service in England has seen allegations of racist, sexist and homophobic comments and behaviours. Every single one.
Now, I think the report says we've had reported discrimination and harassment, examples of discrimination, harassment, and we go on to say a quarter where we found examples of racism, sexism, homophobia.
So are you satisfied that there isn't a problem with race, or do you think it is more deep-seated than that?
I think, as we've highlighted, there are too many problems. These actions are and behaviours that are happening too often. There are still thousands of men and women working for the fire and rescue service that do an excellent job day in, day out. But if we keep finding these behaviours, that's got to stop. You'll see we've made 35 recommendations about misconduct, background checks, training for senior managers, and I'm urging everyone involved with the fire and rescue service to implement without delay.
Is there an issue, though, with how you are monitoring what's going on? Because we know ITV News has done investigations into this as well, and we know from what they have said that there are two forces in particular that have been labelled as good, and yet there were allegations found there, harassment and abuse of women at both South Wales Fire and Rescue Service and Dorset and Wiltshire Fire Service. A serving firefighter was promoted while being investigated for an alleged rape at Tyne and Wear Fire and Rescue Service. So we know these things have been going on, even while forces have been rated as being good.
Yes, and we do know these things have been going on. As I mentioned earlier, we've reported on this since 2018. And one of our national recommendations was for a code of ethics for the fire and rescue service. That was implemented in 2021. What we need to realise is when we inspect services, and I must say we don't inspect South Wales, we are England only. When we inspect services, it's a snapshot in time. It's what we find when we're there and what's reported. If things come up later, as they have with Dorset and Wiltshire, we will take that into account and look into that more clearly in future.
As you say, the investigations sort of started in 2018. I mean, we're sort of a good 5 or 6 years beyond that now. What has been happening in the time that this report, up to this time this report has come out, to stop some of these things from happening if they were first being reported in 2018?
So, 2018, so we had the national recommendation. We've been through 2 full rounds of inspection. We saw some improvement in the second round inspection, but not enough. That's why we made the decision to look even deeper into our evidence and create this report. As you said, there's some terrible behaviours reported in this report, shocking to me, and I've been associated with the fire service for a long time. And I've pulled us back to those recommendations. So I'm urging everyone involved National Fire Chiefs Council, Fire Standards Board, Home Office to get behind those recommendations and implement them without delay.
Yeah, it's just shocking, and it's really worrying, I think, for people, you know, for the public who are then thinking, well, how do they know what firefighter they're dealing with, what history they have, what type of person they are? Can you give the public a guarantee of safety over this?
I cannot give an absolute guarantee that every individual, because of the lack of background checks, is where they should be in the fire and rescue service. But I think what I can guarantee is that if you still need the fire service for an emergency call or you need them to sort out fire safety issues, then please still call 999. You can trust the fire service to turn up and to help you.
Jackie, it was not 2 weeks ago that Baroness Casey's report came out into the Metropolitan Police, which was found guilty of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. Off the back of that, this report that has some, you know, as Mr Wilsher says, has some really shocking findings in it into our fire service. What's happening?
Well, as Charlotte says, it's got some awful echoes of what has clearly happened in the Met, including things like a failure to do proper background checks, which is why that's such a strong recommendation. I think the other worrying thing is that the fire service, and I'm not sure I realised this before, is the least diverse public service. And it's become a bit fashionable amongst government ministers at the moment to have a go about, you know, diversity work in the health service and other areas. But what this shows us is if you don't have a range of backgrounds within an organisation, you get the sort of corrosive, awful behaviour that we've seen here in the fire service. And as Charlotte also rightly says, we need to trust people who are wearing uniforms, who we're depending on for our lives in some circumstances. And if people feel they can't, or if people feel the fire service isn't a place where I would be welcome and would be able to work, that's bad for all of us.
And you were talking about the, you know, being more diverse. So the latest figures, 95.6% white and just 8.2% women.
Yeah.
Ian, what do you think needs to happen with this? There's obviously been a massive failure, hasn't there?
Well, there clearly has, but I think the Casey report, this report, shines a light on two different organisations. I suspect if there was a report into all sorts of other organisations, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector, you would find probably similar things happening. I think there is a recognition that there's a problem. I interviewed Matt Rack, the Fire Brigades Union leader, not that long ago, and put this to him, expecting him to sort of slightly downplay it, but absolutely not. And when you've got the main trade unions saying there's a real problem, and they're obviously representing their members, I think there is a recognition, and hopefully something will change. Now, they will say, I mean, those figures you read out there show a lack of diversity. If you had the figures from 10 years ago, I suspect it would have been 98% and probably 2%. So they can say, well, we've made a bit of progress, but clearly there's a lot more to be done.
Let's go back to Mr Wilsher for one last answer then, if we may, because we're nearly out of time. I mean, how confident are you that things can turn round? And in terms of turning those things around, because these are really damning reports, aren't they, that the time frame in which you want things to improve?
So I am confident. With these recommendations, we've talked to the organisations we've made recommendations to. You've already heard yourself the main union, and I know the other unions are backing this response. I know the Chief Fire Officer are, I know the Home Office are. If everyone gets together, implements the recommendations, I'm convinced things can improve, and they should improve. This behaviour needs to stop. And
is there a drive for more diversity within the fire brigade?
Very much so. It's not been successful so far. Your colleagues on your show already said how important it is to have diversity of thought, but also you're missing out on talent. If you don't recruit from all parts of the community and have those all parts of the community joining you, you could well be missing out on the talent we need in the fire and rescue service. OK, well, look, we're going to have to leave it there, but Roy Wilsher, who's His Majesty's Inspector of Fire and Rescue Services, thank you for joining us this morning. Jackie and Ian, good to have your thoughts as well.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming in. I mean, I think these findings have, you know, shocked so many people this morning, haven't they, with what's been going on. And it's shocking just how widespread it is, and actually the suggestion that it could be even more serious, it's just that hasn't been uncovered.
Yeah, and we've spent the past few months investigating this, and victim after victim has told us that in some cases the hero has become their harasser. Firefighters accused in our reporting of sexual assault on female members of staff, of taking photographs of women who've died in car crashes and sharing them on WhatsApp groups, laughing and joking about their bodies. We've heard stories of firefighters being promoted, allegedly, while under investigation for rape by the police, and of firefighters being able to retire on the quiet, even when they have been found guilty of misconduct like sexual assault. So these are really serious accusations, and what the Inspectorate has done today is it's taken all of our reporting and its own investigations and pulled that together and said there is a problem in every single service in England, including in about a quarter of those services, racism, homophobia or misogyny.
In your report, you had a whistleblower who called this report rigged and mentioned that management were being brainwashed into what they could tell inspectors. I mean, that sounds like it's sort of the report that's come from the Inspectorate is being undermined by the people that have had to sort of give information to it.
Yeah, what our whistleblower was describing, Ben, is the way the inspections are carried out. So when the Inspectorate goes into a fire service, which it does on a routine basis to inspect, our whistleblower says it's quite easy to rig those inspections because you just tell the Inspectorate what your boss wants them to hear. So they were literally saying to us that management were coming down, holding a meeting and saying, look, when the inspector comes in, make sure you say this, this and this. Now, the Inspectorate said in reply to me yesterday, look, you know, that's just a snapshot of one moment in time, and we do actually carry out far more rigorous methods of assessing a service. So they contest that it's easy to rig it, but it's certainly a concern for those we've spoken to within the service.
Although he did say, because we had Roy Wilsher in this morning, His Majesty's Inspector of Fire and Rescue Services, and, you know, again, he was sort of saying, we put that point to him about your findings in those two specific fire services about the harassment and abuse of women in Dorset and Wiltshire, wasn't it? And then the other finding in Tyne and Wear that a firefighter was promoted while being investigated for an alleged rape. And they had been rated as being good forces. And he was saying that actually if we go in and the bit that we see is overall looks good, then we'll mark it as good. So it seems that there isn't enough probing of what's going on. He seemed to be pointing the fact that that reporting and people coming forward wasn't good enough.
Yeah, and for me, the thing that really stands out is in both those two services that you mentioned there, we're not talking about some random firefighter on the front line who's, you know, one of 500 who happens to have been found guilty of some kind of misconduct. In Dorset and Wiltshire, it was the Assistant Chief Fire Officer. So this is literally the right-hand man to the big boss who was found guilty of misconduct, including sexual harassment of women. Now, he was dismissed, able to retire, actually, on full pension without any sanction whatsoever, just a few months, about 18 months or so, before the Inspectorate said that service was good. So if they're not detecting that literally the number 2 or number 3 in a fire service is a wrong,
so the theory is it's
then I'm not sure what they are detecting.
That's coming from the top, then?
Yeah, there is that concern that it's coming from the top. And also, you mentioned Tyne and Wear. The firefighter who was promoted there whilst under police investigation for rape is also pretty senior. Not quite as senior as in Dorset and Wiltshire, but pretty senior. So there is a concern that it's coming from the top. And as I say, that the Inspectorate, if they can't capture what's going up at the top of an organisation, how are they getting into the weeds of what's going on the front line?
How much faith do you have in the recommendations and actually helping to turn this around? I mean, bringing attention to it is hugely important, but it seems like it's a huge task on their hands.
Yeah, I think the Inspectorate gets it this morning, and I think they have been actually very proactive in the past few months in trying to turn this around. The big question for me is what the fire services now do in response. They talk a good talk, many of them, but we found they don't always want to walk the walk. For example, one service took out lawyers against us, threatened us with libel if we reported some of the accusations within their service. We know of women who've come forward over the course of our investigation who are now being hounded by men in the service and trying to force them out of the service for speaking up. So, you know, it's very easy for these services to say publicly, this is awful, we're going to get to grips with it, but actually privately, many of them are in a bit of a denial, actually. I don't think they really recognise the scale of the problem.
But hopefully now it's been raised that action will be taken, because it's so important to have that public trust, isn't it?
Exactly, and, you know, firefighters do have a hero status, and the vast majority of them have earned that status, and they deserve that status, and it's the minority who are undermining that and sometimes playing on that hero status to cover up and use it as a cover for pretty awful behaviour.
OK, well, listen, Paul, thanks for coming in and talking through, you know, your investigations, what you've found, and, you know, as we say, hopefully by raising it, by shining a light on it, it will get better. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul.